Hi there, my name is Megan, and this is my 413 personality development final project. I hope you enjoy it. So, a common theme that is eminent in developmental research is how already at a very young age, humans tend to prefer their own group and disfavor other groups. Examining the early tendencies of preverbal infants might help to shed some light onto the origins of problems of racism and intergroup bias that are still a problem in the world today, and the subsequent inequality that follows those tendencies. So, by the first year of life, infants have shown preference to those who speak the same language as them, as found in a study by Kinsler et al. They also prefer those that belong to familiar social groups, as found by Pun et al., and also associate positive stimuli with their own race faces and negative stimuli with other race faces, found in a study by Chow et al. So these three studies really illustrate that before infants can even talk, so preverbal infants are already showing throughout various aspects of life preference for members of their own group when compared to members of other groups. So at about the same age, it's also been found at around 12 months, infants look to others for guidance in ambiguous situations. So that is performing something which is called social referencing. And for an example, Repacholi et al. Found that infants will approach a novel object if it's presented positively, and they tend to avoid it if it's presented negatively, showing that they look to others for guidance on how to approach a novel situation. However, there seems to be many factors at play when it comes to who infants look to for information, and this can tend to vary a little bit as well. So just to tie together the research mentioned just now with the idea of social referencing would be that, as mentioned, infants do show a preference for their in-group and also do use other people as references. So kind of as a broad picture question moving forward would be whether or not infants show preferences for certain groups when deciding who to use as a social reference. So in 2009, Sternberg did a study that looked into infant social referencing tendencies, and she found that when presented with an ambiguous stimulus, infants actually looked more to an experimenter than to their own mother in this study. So this sort of implies that attachment processes may not be the only thing that infants go to when looking for a social reference, and there might be more things at play than just them looking at someone that they are familiar with. So the study sort of implies that at a very young age, infants might already be developing some sort of cognition with regard to judgment of who might best define a situation. And in this case, it was suggested that the unfamiliar experimenter was judged by the infant as knowing more about a situation potentially than their mother, and perhaps this is why they looked to the unfamiliar experimenter in the context rather than their mother. Sheeler, Koenig, and Budelman also investigated whether infants preferred to receive and use information provided by an unfamiliar experimenter compared with a familiar parent, and whether this pattern depended on the context. So whether this was influenced whether the infant was at home in a familiar place or in the laboratory in an unfamiliar place. And the results in this study showed that there was no effect of context, but that infants did pay more attention to the unfamiliar experimenter when they were searching for information, but their behavior, so their information use, was more congruent with the reactions of the familiar parent. Again, this study exemplifies how there are many factors at play when it comes to infant social referencing behavior, and they can use familiar and unfamiliar people in different ways depending on whether they are searching for information and also using information. In one more study in 2017, Sternberg also found that infants play longer with a toy after receiving positive information about that toy from an adult who was successful in a previous task within the study versus an adult that showed incongruent responses and no success on a task. So this again suggests that infants' referring behavior can vary depending on how they judge the experimenter as knowledgeable, and also affects how much or how likely they are to use this person as a social reference and regulate their behavior as a consequence. So all three of these studies exemplify how infants don't just use someone that is really familiar to them when performing social referencing, but they are actually making judgments with respect to the characteristics of the experimenters, and subsequently use these judgments to decide to what extent they will use these people as a social reference. It has previously been shown in a study by Wheeler et al. That infants do prefer to look at faces of the same race rather than faces of a different race. So this sort of brings me to my question of whether or not the race of the experimenter will have an effect on the social referencing behavior of the infant. Previously, several aspects of social referencing have been studied, including the effects of contingency, familiarity, even gender of the adult on their social referencing behavior of the infant. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been a study that looks at the effects of race on social referencing behavior. And it is important to look into the effects of race, as they might be useful into shedding light onto the development of in-group preferences that can potentially develop into racial attitudes that still stand as a hurdle to inequality in our society, and also maybe help determine if these tendencies are embedded in us as humans in early infancy, or whether or not this is something that we develop and can maybe be mitigated. Already at 9 months, infants already associate own race faces with positive stimuli, as stated above in the study by Chow et al., and also tend to engage more with own race faces and withdraw from unfamiliar race faces, as found in a study done by Quinn et al. In 2018. Due to these findings, I expect that 12-month-old infants will show greater engagement after positive presentation of a novel object by someone of the same race, rather than when it is presented also positively but by someone of a different race. To carry out this study, I would want to recruit participants that would be 12 months old, as infants at this age have shown significant results in past social referencing research. The mothers would be present throughout the study, with the infant sitting opposite the experimenter at a table. And the infants would be randomly designated into one of two groups. One group would see a same race experimenter, and the other group would see an experimenter of a different race, but a race that is still familiar. For an example, taking a sample of Caucasian infants in Vancouver, BC, using a Caucasian experimenter would be obviously the same race experimenter, and then using someone of Chinese ethnicity as the other race experimenter would provide someone of another race, but someone of a race that infants are most likely familiar with due to the overlap in those two ethnicities in that part of the world. A video camera would be set up behind the experimenters and facing at the infant, which would be used for later analysis by a blind experimenter in recording how much time the infant is to engage with the novel object. So in part one, there would be a habituation period where the experimenter would be present at the table in the room with the infant with a neutral expression on their face, but not engaging with the infant, maybe looking down, reading for about 1 minute. And then in the experimental phase next, experimenters would present a novel object, and something that was used previously in a study was a 20 centimeter tall mechanical dinosaur in Sternberg's study in 2009. And this, according to her, met the stimulus criteria of ambiguous, so something that infants were not necessarily scared of, but something that they had not encountered before. So the experimenter would bring out this ambiguous or unfamiliar toy and play with it for a set amount of time and express a set amount of positive expressions about the toy. So this would be equal between same race and other race experimenters. And after the experimenters had presented the toy positively for the set amount of time to the infant, they would then present the toy to the infant and give them the opportunity to reach for it. So then later, during analysis, the blind experimenter from the video camera would record how much time the infant spent engaging with the toy. And maybe it would be that they don't reach for it all, and that would be a 0, or maybe they reach for the toy and play with it for a few seconds or for a few minutes. So that time of engagement after positive presentation is what would be recorded. So to propose some results, if the infant is more likely to use the same race experimenter as a social reference, as stated in the hypothesis, they should show longer engagement time with the unfamiliar toy when it is presented positively by the same race experimenter. So based on evidence of in-group preference that occurs already at 9 months, at 12 months it seems likely that infants would use positive information about a stimulus from someone who's the same race, more so than someone from another race. Implications of studies such as this one could be taken in several directions. If the findings of the study were as hypothesized and infants did prefer to engage more with a toy that was presented by someone of the same race compared to someone of another race, it could suggest that they do indeed take social referencing cues from a same race experimenter more so than from other race experimenters. This information might be useful when looking into how social referencing and same race preferences might relate to an innate aspect of racial bias that occurs early in life. And if we gain insight into some aspects of racial bias development during childhood, this information could potentially be applied in the mitigation of some of the negative effects that these biases have in our society. But on another note, the fact that infants prefer to use people of their own race as a social reference could also be extremely beneficial for a child as they grow up and sort of make sense biologically, perhaps playing a part in reducing social tensions and gaining them advantage with members of their own group. If infants are in tune from a young age with cultural norms through social referencing, it could create smooth integration into their own population as they age. Other research could be done in order to solidify further at what point in development exactly social referencing behavior emerges in infants. And this could be helpful as it might be able to serve as a platform for mitigation in the adoption of racial and intergroup bias that seems to occur, and also might help to determine more surely whether or not these in-group preferences are totally innate, and if they aren't, maybe we can try to develop some ways to mitigate them. Another direction of research could also examine how the effect of different expressions varies. In this study, it was proposed to look at positive expression, but other studies could look at expressions of fear or expressions of disgust with respect to an unfamiliar toy and see how these different emotional valences affect social referencing in infants. That brings me to the end of my research proposal, and thanks for watching.